Where in the UK can we house migrants and refugees? I mean, hundreds of Ukrainian refugees and families have been left homeless in England after arriving on visas designed to secure them a place to live. And that was despite the government insisting that Homes for Ukraine and the family visa schemes would ensure that refugees had housing, and both are leaving people struggling with arrangements when they break down. And then, of course, you've got the government's plan to Rwanda. That's hit the rocks, hasn't it? There's loads of snags in that one. The first flight being halted minutes before takeoff due to an intervention by the European Court of Human Rights. Then there's a plan to convert former RAF base in North Yorkshire village, in that lovely village of Linton-on-Ouse, into a reception centre for asylum seekers. Questions have been asked now. So where can we place people and where can they be homed? What do you think? That's what we're asking for our Great British Debate this hour. Where in the UK can we house migrants and refugees? Well, I'm joined by London representative of the National Residents Landlords Association, Richard Blanco, Ricardo Blanco.
Hello, Nana.
Nana.
Nana. Oh, sorry. Get it right.
So, right, OK, so we've tried these different things. There's a lot of people who are saying, no, you can't do that. The Church of England saying it's ungodly or whatever they called it. The Rwanda scheme. The people in Linton-on-Ouse, rightly, don't want to be doubled, triple the size because an extra load of people have suddenly arrived in the village because that's difficult for them to manage. And then, we're spending $5 million a day housing people in hotels. Where? What can we do?
It's tricky, isn't it? Because I think the problem is what we don't do is identify kind of 1,000 homes and then say, OK, let's get 1,000 refugees and put them in those homes. What we tend to do is discover that we've got a certain number of refugees and then try and find homes for them. I mean, the government has set up schemes like the most recent ones are the Afghan resettlement scheme. And with that one, landlords were asked to provide properties for Afghans, and that was through local authorities. So that was quite well organised.
Yeah.
Some of the challenges are that Afghan families tend to be quite large because they have kind of extended families with them. So that was tricky. And the Ukraine scheme, of course, has been this matching system where if you've got a room available in your house, you put yourself forward for the scheme. But generally what happens is local authorities have to just find what housing they can.
Yeah.
Very often they're using temporary accommodation, they're using hotels. And the problem is there's a massive national shortage of housing. And of course, there isn't enough housing for UK citizens. So, it then becomes a real stretch if we try and find more housing for, as we need to, of course, for refugees.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, now? Because obviously I feel for refugees and people who come from different countries, especially if they're fearing persecution. I don't have as much sympathy for people coming across the channel by dinghy, only because I just, for me, that's just, we need to find a proper way that people can come to this country and not that way, because ultimately it's dangerous. It's dangerous, for starters. But with all this objection, there doesn't seem to be any solutions, though. I can't see where the people are going to go and where it will be acceptable in terms of the British public, who are many saying, oh, it's terrible, the Rwanda plan's terrible, terrible, but yet without an alternative.
Yeah,
and that's my issue.
Well, the big issue is we need to build more houses, and I'm sure you'll be sick of hearing commentators saying that when we come to talk about housing issues. But the government set a target of 300,000 new homes every year. It hasn't met that yet, and it looks like it's unlikely to meet that in the next few years. In order for that to be fulfilled, we need about 200,000 new rented properties coming every year. But actually, the government's disincentivising landlords from renting properties at the moment. A lot of landlords are starting to sell up. So the government, is failing to kind of think in a joined-up way about all of this. I think that would be my biggest criticism.
But, OK, so now, though, let's deal with now. OK, so they may need to build 200,000 homes to start catching up with the situation. But more and more people are arriving here on a daily basis. So what about now? What are the solutions now? Because I just can't see any. And I hear a lot of objection to things, but I don't see any solutions. So I'm just like...
No, I mean, the solutions now are temporary accommodation on the whole. If you are deemed to be homeless or in housing need by your local authority, the local authority will try and find you temporary accommodation. Typically, if you're in London, you may well get sent to Stoke-on-Trent or, somewhere quite a long way away where there are more housing resources. And, often the government resettlement schemes have resettled people in parts of the UK, Glasgow, wherever, the Kent coast or where there are more properties available.
What do you think of the Linton-on-Ouse plan, then? Army bases. Is that an idea?
Well, we've seen a lot of commercial premises turned into residential housing, and I think the fact that we're looking at ex-army bases shows how desperate really we are to try and find whatever accommodation we can.
Why don't we look at housing indigenous population? Because there's a lot of people who could do with places that are on waiting lists and queues and things like that. Couldn't we put those people in army bases or mix it up a bit? Instead of having all refugees in one place, so all the people who've come across the channel, why don't you fill it up with people who are from this country as well, who've lived here, but also mix it in so there's more integration?
I agree. I mean, I'm not a fan of ghettos at all. I live in Hackney where, the street's incredibly varied. We've got private owners, housing association, council tenants. I think those are the most successful kind of settlements. It's not a good idea to just shove everyone in the same kind of place together. And, we've certainly seen schemes where refugees have suffered because of that. Yeah. So it's best to mix it up, absolutely.
So we don't really have any real answers at the moment, but we'll keep thinking.
We need to build more houses. That's what we need to do.
Take time.
Yes.
Mind you, they can build them in weeks, can't they?
Well, yes, they can come prefab now, can't they?
Exactly. Well, Richard, it's always a pleasure. Ricardo Blanco. Thank you so much. That's wonderful.
You, my pleasure.